everyone. Welcome to Realist Quill. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? The first time I noticed something was wrong with Pinwood Sanatorium was when the walls seemed to exhale. Like most stories that end badly, it started with a YouTube video. My name's Elijah Reed, and I run a small urban exploration channel called Forgotten Footsteps. Nothing fancy, just me and my camera documenting abandoned places around New England. I'd built up a decent following of about 30,000 subscribers, which wasn't huge by any standard, but it paid the bills alongside my part-time gig at the local coffee shop. The comment appeared under my video exploring an abandoned mental hospital in Western Massachusetts. If you want to see something really interesting, check out Pinwood Sanatorium in northern Vermont. Not many urbexers have documented it. Place has been abandoned since I get suggestions like this all the time, but something about this one stuck with me. When I searched online, I found almost nothing about Pinwood. Just a few sparse mentions in old newspaper archives about a tuberculosis sanatorium that later became a general hospital before closing in. There were no photos, no urbex reports, nothing that would normally accompany a spot that had been explored before. That alone was enough to pique my interest. An untouched location. In this day and age, I had to see it for myself. You're seriously going to drive 4 hours for a place you barely know anything about? My roommate Danny looked at me over her coffee mug, skepticism written all over her face. That's kind of the appeal, I replied, packing my camera gear. Besides, Riley and Marcus are coming along, safety in numbers and all that. Danny rolled her eyes. Your fellow idiots don't count as safety. Riley and Marcus had been my exploration partners for the past 2 years. Riley was a history major with a talent for researching the backstories of the places we visited. And Marcus was a sound engineer who helped capture ambient audio for our video. Together we'd explored dozens of locations without serious incident, though we'd had our share of close calls with security guards and rotting floorboards. We'll be fine. It's just another abandoned hospital, I said, zipping up my backpack. Just be careful, alright? Some of these old places have asbestos, chemical waste, all sorts of nasty stuff. Always am. We'll be back tomorrow night. The drive to northern Vermont was gorgeous, especially with the fall foliage at its peak. As Marcus drove, Riley briefed us on what little she'd managed to find about Pinwood. So get this, she said, scrolling through her tablet. Pinwood started as a TB sanatorium in the 1920s, like most of these places, but after antibiotics made TB less of a threat, they converted it to a general hospital that specialized in respiratory illnesses. Makes sense, Marcus commented, eyes on the winding mountain road. Keep the specialty, but broaden the scope. Yeah, but here's where it gets interesting. In 1973, they suddenly shut down the entire pulmonary ward. No explanation given in any newspaper I could find. Then in 1974, the whole hospital closed. I turned to her. No reason given at all? None that I could find in public records. There was some vague statement about modernizing healthcare elsewhere, but that's it. Might have been asbestos, Marcus suggested. Lots of these old places shut down when asbestos remediation became too expensive. Maybe, Riley said, but she didn't sound convinced. But why close a specific ward first? We fell silent as Marcus turned off the main highway onto a narrower road that wound deeper into the mountains. The GPS signal was getting spotty, but according to our research, we needed to take this road for another 7 miles. Then find a dirt access road that would lead us to the abandoned facility. I think that's it, I said after another 20 minutes of driving, pointing to a barely visible break in the tree line. Marcus slowed down and made the turn onto what was once a road but now resembled a hiking trail more than anything else. We should probably park here and walk the rest of the way, he said after we'd gone about half a mile and the path had narrowed considerably. Don't want to get the car We grabbed our gear, cameras, flashlights, masks. Old hospitals often had mold issues, and backpacks with water and snacks, and set out on foot. The forest was dense around us, with barely any sunlight filtering through the canopy of orange and red leaves. Though it was only 3 p.m., it felt much later in the day. How much farther? Riley asked after we'd been walking for about 20 minutes. I checked the GPS on my phone, which was miraculously still working. Should be just ahead, maybe another quarter mile. And then suddenly the trees parted, and there it was, Pinewood Sanatorium. The main building was a massive brick structure, 4 stories tall with wings extending out from both sides. Unlike many abandoned places I'd visited, the exterior was in surprisingly good condition. No broken windows, no obvious structural damage, just the expected weathering from decades of exposure to Vermont's harsh seasons. Whoa, Marcus whispered. It looks preserved. He was right. Most abandoned hospitals from this era were heavily vandalized, with broken windows and graffiti everywhere. This place looked almost untouched. Are we sure it's actually abandoned? Riley asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Has to be. Look at the overgrowth, I replied, pointing to the ivy climbing up the walls and the small trees that had sprouted through cracks in the concrete walkways. Nobody's maintained this place in decades. We approached the main entrance, a grand doorway with Pinewood Sanatorium still visible in faded letters above it. The double doors were chained shut, but a side entrance nearby had its door ajar. Shall we? I asked, already knowing the answer. Riley adjusted her camera strap. Lead on, fearless leader. The side door opened with a prolonged creak that echoed through whatever space lay beyond. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside, followed closely by Riley and Marcus. We found ourselves in what appeared to be a service corridor. The air was stale but not as musty as I'd expected. No overwhelming smell of mold or decay, just the faint antiseptic scent that seems to permanently permeate hospitals, even long-abandoned ones. Temperature dropped like 10 degrees, Marcus noted, zipping up his jacket. He was right. Outside, it had been a crisp but comfortable autumn day. In here, our breath was visible in the beams of our flashlights. Let's head toward the main hallway, I suggested. Should be to our right if the floor plan is typical for sanatoriums of this era. We moved slowly down the corridor, our footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The beam of my flashlight revealed walls painted in that peculiar institutional green that was so popular in mid-century institutions. Paint was peeling in places, but again, the deterioration was less than I would have expected after 50 years of abandonment. Listen, Riley whispered suddenly. We all froze, straining our ears. I don't hear anything, Marcus said after a moment. Exactly, Riley replied. No birds, no insects, no wind, nothing. She was right. The silence was absolute in a way that felt unnatural. Most abandoned buildings had some ambient noise. The settling of the structure, wildlife that had moved in, the whistle of wind through broken windows or cracks. Here, there was nothing. Probably just good insulation, I said, though I didn't quite believe it myself. Come on, let's find the main area. We continued down the hallway until we reached a set of double doors. I pushed them open, revealing a vast lobby area. Dust particles danced in the beams of our flashlights as we swept them across the space. A reception desk stood in the center, its wooden surface coated in a thick layer of dust. Behind it, a large board still displayed room assignments and doctor schedules, frozen in time from the hospital's last day of operation. This is incredible, Riley breathed, already snapping photos. It's like they just locked the doors and walked away. She was right. There were still papers on the desk, pens in holders, even a half-filled coffee mug, now containing only dust. It was eerie how preserved everything was. Let's check out the wards, I suggested. The pulmonary ward should be particularly interesting, given that it closed before the rest of the hospital. We found a directory on the wall that indicated the pulmonary ward was on the 3rd floor of the east wing. As we made our way toward the stairwell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. Not just the usual unease that comes with exploring abandoned buildings, but something more specific that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The stairwell was dark, our flashlights creating distorted shadows as we climbed. The steps were concrete and seemed stable, but we tested each one before putting our full weight on it. A habit formed from years of urban exploration in less structurally sound buildings. When we reached the third floor, we found another set of double doors with pulmonary wards stenciled on them in fading letters. They were closed but not locked. I pushed them open, and we stepped into a long corridor with rooms on either side. This is where they would have kept the TB patients, Riley explained, her voice hushed despite there being no one around to disturb. The idea was to give them plenty of fresh air and sunlight. That's why all these rooms have such large windows. Indeed, each patient room had a large window, though many were now covered in grime that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into a murky yellow glow. We began exploring the rooms systematically, documenting everything with our camera. Most rooms contained a basic metal bed frame, a small bedside table, and not much else. In some, personal effects remained: books, photographs, small trinkets that patients or staff had left behind in the sudden closure. "Hey, look at this," Marcus called from one of the rooms. We joined him to find what appeared to be a doctor's office, more intact than the patient rooms we'd seen. A desk with a leather chair behind it dominated the space, and bookshelves lined the walls, still filled with medical texts. Riley moved to examine the books while I approached the desk. A nameplate read Dr. Howard Mitchell, Chief of Pulmonary Medicine. The desk's surface was covered in papers, many of them patient files. I knew better than to disturb them too much. Patient confidentiality was still a concern, even for people who had been treated here half a century ago. But something caught my eye. A leather-bound journal tucked beneath some folders. Curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully slid it out. The cover was plain with no name or title, just the imprint of what might have been a medical caduceus, worn almost to invisibility. "Should you be touching that?" Riley asked, looking over my shoulder. "Probably not," I admitted, "but I'm just going to take a quick look. Could give us some context for the video." I opened the journal to a random page near the middle. The handwriting was tight and precise, clearly belonging to someone with medical training. The entry was dated March 12, 1973, just months before the pulmonary ward closed. Patient N47 exhibiting same symptoms as the other. Initial presentation consistent with standard pneumonia, but X-rays show the unusual branching patterns in the lower lobes, breathing becoming labored despite oxygen therapy. The sound upon auscultation is unlike anything I've encountered in 30 years of pulmonary medicine. When I place the stethoscope on the chest wall, it sounds almost as if there is something moving independently of the patient's breathing rhythm. I flipped a few pages forward. April 3, 1973. 3 more cases admitted today, all workers from the northern section of the old mine. Board is pressing me for answers I don't have. I've sent tissue samples to colleagues at Johns Hopkins, but they report nothing unusual in the slides. Yet I know what I'm seeing in these patients is not normal. The way the tissue moves. The next entry made my blood run cold. April 17, 1973. Patient N47 expired at 3:17 a.m. Requested immediate autopsy, which I performed myself. What I found defies medical explanation. The bronchial tissue had developed a strange, almost fungal appearance. But unlike any fungal infection I've seen, the tissue was responsive. Even excised from the body, it continued to exhibit movement for nearly 20 minutes. I've preserved samples and will be driving them personally to the research facility in Burlington tomorrow. God help us if this is contagious. Jesus, I muttered, looking up at Riley and Marcus, who were now both reading over my shoulder. Did you find anything about a mine in your research? Riley shook her head. Nothing. But northern Vermont has a mining history, mostly copper and a bit of gold. Could be referring to any of them. I continued reading, flipping through more entries that documented additional cases with similar symptoms. Dr. Mitchell's writing became increasingly frantic as more patients were admitted and more died from what he called the pulmonary anomaly. The final entry was dated June 28, 1973. The day before the pulmonary ward was shuttered, according to Riley's research. The board has made their decision. The entire ward is to be closed immediately. Patients are being transferred to Burlington and Boston. I argued that moving them could spread whatever this is, but I was overruled. They're more concerned with containing the story than containing the disease, if that's even what this is. I'm not convinced it's infectious in the traditional sense. Only those with direct exposure to the mine have been affected. But there's something in that mine, something that doesn't belong in human lungs. I've sealed my samples and research notes in the old storage room behind the dispenser. If anyone finds this and wants the truth, that's where to look. I won't be staying to see what the board decides to do with the rest of Pinwood. After what I've witnessed these past months, I can't trust that their decisions will be made with public health as the priority. I closed the journal, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the abandoned hospital. We need to find that storage room, I said, looking at Riley and Marcus. Marcus frowned. Is that really a good idea? Whatever was making these people sick could still be here. It's been 50 years, I countered. If it was something dangerous, we'd have heard about outbreaks. Besides, aren't you curious about what made them shut this place down so suddenly? Riley seemed torn. I am curious, but Marcus has a point. We don't know what we're dealing with. Look, we'll wear our masks and we won't touch anything that looks suspicious. I promised. But this could be the story that takes our channel to the next level. Uncovering the mystery of Pinwood Sanatorium. That's the kind of content that goes viral. After some discussion, they reluctantly agreed. We found a floor plan on the wall that showed the location of the dispensary, at the far end of the pulmonary ward. As we made our way there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air was getting thicker, more difficult to breathe. I chalked it up to suggestion from reading the journal, but I still found myself taking shallower breath. The dispensary was a large room filled with old medication cabinets, most of them empty. Steel countertops lined the walls, and in the center was a preparation area where nurses would have once measured out medications for their patients. He said the storage room was behind the dispensary. I murmured, scanning the walls for a door. There, Riley pointed to a narrow door, partially hidden behind one of the cabinets. It might have been easily overlooked if we weren't specifically searching for it. The door was locked, but the old mechanism gave way easily when Marcus applied a bit of pressure with a small pry bar he carried for such situations. The door swung open to reveal a small windowless room that might once have been used for storing sensitive medications. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a space that was noticeably different from the rest of the hospital. While dust covered everything else we'd seen, this room looked almost recently used. Glass containers lined metal shelves, each containing what appeared to be preserved tissue samples floating in yellowish liquid. In the center of the room was a desk with a microscope and various scientific instruments. A large notebook lay open, its pages covered in diagrams and notes in the same handwriting as the journal. "This is creepy as hell," Marcus whispered, panning his camera around the room. I approached the desk carefully, drawn to the note. The page it was open to contained detailed drawings of what looked like lung tissue, but with strange branching structures throughout that didn't match any anatomy I was familiar with. "Look at these samples," Riley said, examining the jars but wisely not touching them. "They don't look like normal tissue." She was right. Even to my untrained eye, the preserved specimens looked wrong somehow. The tissue was darkly discolored and had an unusual branching structure, almost like tiny trees growing within what I assumed were lung samples. As I leaned closer to one of the jars, I noticed something that made me step back involuntarily. The specimen inside, what looked like a section of bronchial tissue, seemed to shift slightly. A subtle movement that might have been a trick of the light or the liquid settling. But then it happened again. A definite movement, like a gentle pulse. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Marcus asked, coming closer. "The sample moved." "That's not possible," Riley said. but she sounded uncertain. These have been preserved for 50 years. I pointed to the jar. Watch. We all stared at the specimen, and after a moment, we saw it. A subtle but unmistakable contraction, like tissue taking a breath. What the fuck? Marcus breathed. Before we could process what we were seeing, a sound caught our attention. A soft whispering noise coming from somewhere outside the storage room. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. "Do you hear that?" Riley asked, her face pale in the beam of the flashlight. We stepped out of the storage room back into the dispensary, and the sound became clearer. A soft, raspy inhale and exhale that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "It's just the wind," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Old buildings make noises, but there was no wind." The air was completely still, just as it had been since we entered the building, and as we listened, the breathing sound grew louder, more labored. "We should go," Riley said, a note of fear in her voice that I'd never heard before. I nodded, suddenly eager to leave this place behind. We made our way back through the pulmonary ward toward the stairwell. But something had changed. The air felt thicker, almost resistant to our movement, like walking through water, and the breathing sound followed us, growing in volume until it seemed to surround us completely. As we reached the stairwell, I glanced back at the ward and froze. The dim light, filtering through the grimy windows, I could see the wallpaper on the corridor rippling, pulsing in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like the chest of a sleeping giant. "Run," I whispered. And then louder. We bolted down the stairs, no longer careful about testing each step before putting our weight on it. The breathing sound crescendoed around us, and I could swear I felt warm air on the back of my neck with each exhale. As we reached the second-floor landing, Riley stumbled, gasping for breath. "I can't breathe," she choked out, clutching at her chest. Marcus and I grabbed her arms, supporting her as we continued downward. By the time we reached the ground floor, we were all struggling for air, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the building. We burst through the side entrance into the gathering dusk, gasping the fresh outside air like drowning victims pulled from water. We didn't stop running until we reached the tri-line, where we finally collapsed, sucking in deep breath. "What the hell was that?" Marcus panted. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent explanation for what we'd experienced. Riley was still wheezing slightly, but her breathing was returning to normal. As my own breathing steadied, I turned to look back at Pinwood Sanatorium, its dark bulk silhouetted against the darkening sky. And that's when I saw it. The subtle expansion and contraction of the entire building, as if the structure itself was a living, breathing entity. "Do you see that?" I whispered. They followed my gaze, and I heard Riley's sharp intake of breath. "The whole building," Marcus murmured. "It's breathing." We watched in horrified fascination as the subtle movement continued. The walls expanding slightly, with each inhale, then contracting with each exhale. It was barely perceptible, something you'd dismiss as an optical illusion under normal circumstances. But after what we'd just experienced inside, we knew it was real. "We need to get out of here," Riley said, her voice shaky. No one argued. We gathered our gear and hurried back along the overgrown path toward where we'd left the car, none of us speaking, all of us listening for the sound of breathing following us through the forest. The drive back was tense and mostly silent. It wasn't until we were well away from Pinwood, back on the main highway, with the lights of civilization visible in the distance, that anyone spoke. "That do we do with the footage?" Marcus. It was a good question. We had documented everything. The journal entries, the preserved specimens, even some of our panicked exit. "We use it," I said after a moment. "But carefully. People need to know what's in that place," Riley agreed. "Whatever it is, it's still active." I nodded. my mind already working on how to frame our experience for the video. But something was nagging at me. A memory of something I'd read in Dr. Mitchell's journal. Something about the mine. 3 days after our return, I was editing the footage when Riley called. "Elijah, you need to see this," she said, her voice urgent. I found more information about Pingwood and the mine. 20 minutes later, she was at my apartment, laptop in hand. She opened it to reveal an archived newspaper article from a small local Vermont paper, dated June. "Cave-in at Northridge Mine claims 5 lives." The headline read. "Northridge," I murmured. "That must be the mine Dr. Mitchell was referring to." Riley nodded. Read the article. The piece described a tragic accident at a copper mine about 10 miles from where Pingwood Sanatorium stood. 5 miners had been killed when they broke through into a previously unknown cavern system, causing a partial collapse. The article noted that rescue efforts were complicated by unusual respiratory distress experienced by the rescue worker. "There's more," Riley said, pulling up another article from 2 weeks later. This one was smaller. Just a brief notice. Northridge Mine permanently closed following safety inspection. No details were provided about what the safety inspection had found. "And then there's this," she said, showing me one final article from July 1974, about a year after the mine incident and around the time Pingwood closed completely. "Former Pingwood doctor found dead in Vermont woods." The article identified the deceased as Dr. Howard Mitchell, whose body had been discovered by hikers. The cause of death was listed as exposure, but the article mentioned that unusual circumstances were being investigated. No follow-up piece ever appeared. "He knew something," I said quietly. "Something about what was in that mine, what was affecting those patients. And now it's in the building itself," Riley added. "Whatever was in those miners' lungs has somehow infected the entire structure." It sounded impossible, yet we had all seen it. The breathing walls, felt the building drawing air like a living organism. "We can't release everything we found," I decided. "It's too dangerous. What if people go there looking for it?" Riley nodded in agreement. "But we should warn people to stay away." In the end, we released a heavily edited version of our exploration, focusing on the abandoned state of the hospital and its history as a tuberculosis sanatorium. We included some of Dr. Mitchell's journal entries about unusual respiratory cases, but left out any mention of the moving tissue samples or the breathing building. In my narration, I emphasized that the building was structurally unsound and potentially contained hazardous materials. Technically true, if not the whole truth. The video performed well, gaining us several thousand new subscribers. Comments poured in, many expressing interest in visiting Pingwood themselves. To each I responded with strong warnings about the dangers of the site. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone, I find myself struggling to breathe, as if invisible hands are squeezing my lungs. I've gone to doctors, had x-rays taken, been tested for asthma and allergies. Everything comes back normal, yet the sensation persists. Especially when my mind wanders back to what we saw in that storage room and the sound of the building breathing around us. Last week Riley called. She's been having the same symptoms. So has Marcus. And yesterday I noticed something in the corner of my bedroom. A small patch of wallpaper that seems to pulse with a rhythm not unlike breathing. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, just like at Pingwood. I don't know what we brought back with us from that place. I don't know if it can be stopped or contained, but I do know this. If you ever hear about Pingwood Sanatorium, if the idea of exploring its abandoned halls ever crosses your mind, stay away. Because some places don't just house ghosts of the past. Some places become something else entirely. Something that waits patiently for new hosts to continue its expansion. And it's breathing. Always breathing. Filling the air with microscopic pieces of itself. Seeking new walls to inhabit. New lungs to call home. I still dream about that underwater neighborhood sometimes. The houses standing silent beneath the surface, preserved like some bizarre time capsule from the 1960s. Furniture floating gently against ceilings, family photos still hanging on walls, all of it suspended in murky green water. But it's the children's bedrooms that haunt me most. Toys arranged neatly on shelves, beds made with cartoon character sheets, as if the kids might return any moment to resume their lives. My name is Tasha Morris. I've been documenting abandoned places for almost a decade now, running a modest YouTube channel called Tasha's Forgotten Spaces that's gathered enough of a following that I can make a living from it. I specialize in places with unusual stories, not just any abandoned building will do. I want history, mystery, something that makes viewers lean in closer to their screens. That's how I first heard about Lakewood Estates. It was during a live stream Q&A with my subscribers when someone named WaterDiver78 asked if I'd ever considered exploring flooded ruins. They mentioned a housing development in western Tennessee that had been intentionally submerged during the creation of a reservoir According to them, the developer had gone bankrupt midway through construction, leaving a half-finished subdivision that was eventually condemned and flooded when the Army Corps of Engineers completed a nearby dam project. The weird thing, WaterDiver78 wrote, is that they never properly evacuated some of the homes. There's still furniture, appliances, everything just sitting underwater for the past 50 years. That caught my attention immediately. Most reservoirs created in the mid-20th century were carefully cleared before flooding. Buildings demolished, debris removed, sometimes even graves relocated. The idea that an entire neighborhood had been flooded with contents intact seemed unlikely, but if true, it would make for incredible footage. I thanked WaterDiver78 for the suggestion and moved on with the stream. But afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about those underwater houses. I started researching and found surprisingly little information online. A few brief mentions in local newspapers about the Woodlake Dam project. Nothing specific about homes being flooded with contents still inside. The absence of information only intrigued me more. After a few days of digging, I managed to find a contact, a retired Army Corps of Engineers employee named Gerald Whitaker, who had worked on the Woodlake project. It took some convincing, but he eventually agreed to meet me at a diner just outside Clarksville. Gerald was in his 80s, thin but strong looking, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. After some small talk, I asked him about Lakewood Estates. His expression darkened. "Who told you about that place?" I explained about the comment on my live stream. He was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee absently. "There were 42 homes in that development," he finally said. "Most were still under construction when the project went bust in '71, but 7 of them, the ones closest to the lake, they were completed. Some even had people living in them for a few months." "What happened to those people?" I asked. "They were relocated, compensated, standard procedure." He took a sip of coffee. "But there was a dispute about the contents of the homes. The developer claimed ownership of the fixtures, appliances, even some of the furniture that had been staged for showing. Legal battle held everything up. So when it came time to flood, the homes were still fully furnished." He nodded. "The Corps tried to delay, but there were deadlines, political pressure. The order came down, proceed with flooding as scheduled." "That's incredible," I said, already imagining the footage. "Do you know exactly where they are? How deep?" Gerald looked uncomfortable. "About 60 feet down at the deepest point. But listen, young lady, that area of the lake is restricted. There are warnings posted. Because of underwater hazards?" He hesitated. "Something like that." I pressed for more details, but Gerald became evasive. He mentioned incidents with divers who'd attempted to explore the submerged neighborhood, but wouldn't elaborate. As our conversation concluded, he slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "These are the coordinates," he said quietly. "If you're determined to go, At least you won't get lost. But I strongly advise against it. Some things are better left alone, especially things under Wood Lake. I thanked him and left, both excited about the potential footage and intrigued by his cryptic warning. I'd heard similar cautions from countless security guards and property owners over the years. Abandoned places often inspire superstition and urban legends. Back at my hotel, I started planning the expedition. I wasn't a certified diver, but I knew someone who was. My ex-boyfriend, Ryan Graham. We'd broken up 2 years earlier, but remained on good terms, occasionally collaborating on videos when his diving expertise was needed. He ran a technical diving company that specialized in underwater inspections of bridges and dams. When I called and explained the situation, Ryan was instantly hooked. An intact underwater subdivision? Are you serious? His excitement was palpable even through the phone. That's a once-in-a-lifetime exploration, Tash. So you'll help? Absolutely. But we'll need a team. At that depth, we can't mess around. Within a week, Ryan had assembled a small crew. Himself, his business partner Mei Lin, an experienced cave diver, and a local diver named Connor, who knew Wood Lake well. I would be the only non-diver, watching their live video feeds from the boat and directing the exploration remotely. It was late September when we arrived at Wood Lake. The tourist season was over, and the lake was quiet. We rented a pontoon boat, large enough to accommodate our equipment, and launched early on a Tuesday morning, when we'd have the lake mostly to ourselves. The weather was perfect, clear skies, minimal wind, and excellent visibility below the surface, according to Connor. As we motored toward the coordinates Gerald had provided, I noticed how empty this section of the lake was. Despite the beautiful conditions, no other boats were visible. Is this area always so deserted? I asked Connor, who was navigating. Pretty much, he replied without elaborating. Ryan, who was checking his diving gear, looked up. People avoid this part of the lake. Local superstition. What kind of superstition? Connor shrugged. Stories about divers going missing, strange sounds underwater, the usual small-town ghost story. Mei, who was calibrating her underwater camera equipment, rolled her eyes. Every lake has those stories, usually invented by locals who want to keep good fishing spots to themselves. Connor didn't respond, but I noticed a tension in his shoulders that wasn't there before. When we reached the coordinates, Ryan used sonar equipment to scan the lake bed. The images that came back were startling. The unmistakable outlines of houses, streets, even what appeared to be a small playground. My God, Mei whispered, staring at the screen. It really is an entire neighborhood down there. Ryan nodded, eyes gleaming with excitement. And look at the definition on these structures. They're fully intact. How is that possible? I asked. Wouldn't 50 years underwater cause significant decay? Not necessarily, Connor said. Freshwater causes less deterioration than saltwater. And if the houses were well built to begin with. He trailed off, studying the sonar images with a frown. Ryan clapped his hands together. All right, let's gear up. Standard procedure. We stay together, maintain communication, and if anyone signals to abort, we all surface immediately. No exceptions. I help them prepare their equipment while setting up my own station, a laptop connected to their camera feeds, extra batteries and recording devices. Each diver would carry a high-definition underwater camera, and Ryan would have an additional 360-degree camera for immersive footage. As they prepared to enter the water, Connor paused, looking troubled. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah, just. He lowered his voice. There's something off about this place, Tasha. The stories about it aren't just superstition. What do you mean? He glanced at Ryan and Mei, who were making final equipment checks. 2 divers went missing here last year. Friends of mine, experienced guys who knew what they were doing. They were exploring this same area. A chill ran through me despite the warm day. What happened to them? Official report says they got disoriented and ran out of air. But Jamie had been diving for 20 years. He wouldn't make rookie mistakes. Connor adjusted his mask. Tell them to be careful in there, especially in the houses. Don't disturb anything. Before I could ask more questions, Ryan announced they were ready. One by one, they rolled backward off the boat into the clear blue water, their bubbles rising to the surface as they descend. I settled in front of my laptop, watching as their camera feeds activated. The first 15 minutes of the dive were uneventful. The water grew darker as they descended, requiring them to activate their powerful dive light. At around 40 feet, the first structures became visible, rooftops emerging from the murky green gloom like strange underwater mountains. We've got visual on the target. Ryan's voice came through the communication system, slightly distorted. Approaching the first structure now. The footage was incredible. A two-story colonial-style home stood perfectly preserved, as if it had been built to be underwater. The white paint was discolored and sloughing off in places, but the structure itself appeared solid. Schools of fish darted around the chimney and in and out of windows whose glass had long since broken. Moving to the front entrance, May reported. Her camera showed her approaching the front door, which hung partially open, swaying slightly in the underwater currents. She hesitated. "Everything okay, May?" I asked. "Yes, just getting a weird feeling, like we're being watched." Ryan's camera swiveled toward her. "Standard psychological response to enclosed underwater spaces. Let's proceed, but carefully. Watch for structural hazard." May nodded and pushed gently against the door, which swung open with surprising ease. The interior of the house was dark, their lights creating eerie shadows as they swept across waterlogged furniture. The living room contained a sofa, coffee table, and a television set from the early 90s. Everything was covered in a layer of silt and algae. "This is insane," Connor whispered. "It's like they just walked away and left everything." They moved deeper into the house, documenting a dining room with a table still set for dinner. Plates, glasses, silverware, all in place. The kitchen beyond had appliances with their doors hanging open, cabinets revealing canned goods and dishes. "Check this out," Ryan said, his camera focusing on a wall calendar. October 1971. This place has been frozen in time since then. As they continued exploring, I directed them toward areas that would make for compelling footage. A study with waterlogged books still on shelves. A bathroom with toiletries still arrayed on the counter. The images were haunting, personal items left behind, now playing host to algae and small fish. But it was when they ascended to the second floor that things started to feel wrong. "I'm picking up interference on my comms," Ryan reported, his voice breaking up slightly. "Same here," May added. "And is it getting colder to you guys?" According to their equipment, the water temperature had dropped several degrees, which Connor said was unusual. Normally, temperature remained consistent at this depth. The master bedroom was largely empty save for a bed frame and dresser. But when they entered what had clearly been a child's room, all three divers stopped moving. "Are you seeing this?" May's voice was barely a whisper. The room was perfectly preserved and fully furnished. A small bed with cartoon character sheets, toys on shelves, clothes in an open closet, even a pair of small shoes placed neatly beside the bed, as if waiting for their owner to step into them. "It looks like the kid just stepped out for a minute," Connor said, his camera panning slowly across the room. Ryan moved closer to a desk where a child's drawings were still pinned to a corkboard. The colors faded but visible. "These drawings, what about them?" I asked, squinting at my screen. "They're not normal." He focused his camera on one drawing in particular. It appeared to show stick figures underwater, surrounding rectangular shapes that might have been houses. But there was something unsettling about the way the figures were drawn. Elongated with too many limbs and oversized eyes. "Kids draw weird stuff all the time," May said. But she sounded uncertain. As Ryan's camera continued to pan, something moved at the edge of the frame, a quick shadow darting past the bedroom doorway. "What was that?" I asked sharply. "What was what?" Ryan replied. "Something moved in the hallway. Didn't you see it?" All three cameras swiveled toward the door. The hallway beyond was empty and still. Probably a fish, Connor suggested. But he didn't sound convinced. They exited the bedroom cautiously and continued their exploration of the house. As they moved toward the next bedroom, the interference on their communications grew worse. Getting really cold now. May's voice crackled through static. What's going on with the equipment? I asked, increasingly concerned. Not sure, Ryan replied. But we should probably wrap up here and check out one more house before our air gets low. They finished documenting the second floor and descended back to the first level. As they approached the front door, all 3 cameras suddenly captured the same thing. A child-sized figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the murky water outside. Jesus Christ, Connor exclaimed. The figure didn't move. It appeared to be watching them, though no features were visible in the silhouette. Ryan, I called, my heart racing. What am I looking at? Before he could answer, the figure darted away, moving with a speed and fluidity that seemed impossible underwater. Did you see that? May's voice was tight with fear. I saw something, Ryan replied, his professional calm starting to crack. Could be another diver. There's no one else out here, Connor said. And that wasn't a person. Despite their obvious unease, they exited the house and moved on to the next structure. A slightly smaller ranch-style home a short distance away. As they approached, I noticed something odd in the footage. Ryan, can you focus on those windows? He directed his light toward the front of the house, illuminating 2 large picture windows. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement inside, shadows passing behind the glass. Are there people in there? I asked. That's not possible, Ryan said, but he sounded uncertain. No one could be living down here. The 3 divers exchanged glances, their breathing audible through the comms. Finally, Ryan spoke again. Let's check it out. But we stay together, and at the first sign of trouble, we abort. They approached the second house cautiously. This one appeared less well preserved, with part of the roof collapsed and more obvious decay. The front door was missing entirely, creating a dark maw that seemed to swallow their light beams. As they entered, the interference on their communications worsened dramatically. Their voices came through in broken fragments, and their camera feeds began to glitch, showing static and distorted images. Something wrong with equipment. Ryan's voice barely penetrated the static, getting dizzy. That was May, her camera feed showing her swaying slightly. Connor's voice was clearer, tinged with rising panic. We need to get out of here, now. Through the deteriorating feeds, I could see they had entered what appeared to be a living room similar to the first house. But something was different. The furniture seemed arranged in an odd configuration, almost like a circle. And in the center of that circle was what looked like a collection of objects, photographs, toys, jewelry, and other personal items. What is that? I asked, but no one responded. The interference was too strong. Suddenly, all 3 camera feeds showed the same thing, movement all around them. Dark shapes, vaguely human but wrong somehow, emerging from doorways, from behind furniture, even seeming to materialize from the walls themselves. The shapes moved with that same impossible fluidity I'd seen earlier, circling the divers. Jet out, I screamed into the microphone, unsure if they could even hear me. Their camera feeds showed they were trying to retreat toward the entrance, but more shapes blocked their path. Through the glitches and static, I caught glimpses of pale, distorted faces, with oversized black eyes and mouths that opened too wide. The feeds cut out entirely for several agonizing seconds. When they returned, all 3 divers were outside the house, swimming rapidly toward the surface, their breathing ragged and panicked over the comms, following us. May's terrified voice broke through. I looked at the depth indicators on their equipment feeds. They were ascending too quickly. Slow down, I called. You'll get the bends. Whether they heard me or were simply trained well enough to remember their safety protocols, they slowed their ascent, though their panic was still evident in their rapid breathing. As they rose through the water column, the interference gradually lessened. By the time they reached their decompression stop at 15 feet, Communications were mostly restored. What happened down there? I demanded. Not now, Ryan gasped. Just be ready when we surface. Those 15 minutes of decompression seemed to stretch forever. I kept scanning their feeds for signs of pursuit, but there was nothing visible behind them. Just the dark water, and far below, the dim outlines of the submerged house. When they finally surfaced beside the boat, I helped them aboard one by one. All three were pale and shaking. May immediately removed her mask and vomited over the side of the boat. Connor sat with his head in his hands, while Ryan methodically but shakily began removing his equipment. What the hell happened? I asked again once they had recovered somewhat. They exchanged looks, none seeming eager to speak first. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. There's something down there, Tasha. Something not right. Those weren't divers we saw, May added, wiping her mouth. They weren't people. Not anymore. Connor nodded grimly. I think I know what happened to my friends now. What are you talking about? I demanded. What did you see? Ryan reached for his dive computer and detached the small device. It's all recorded, but I'm not sure you want to see it. Despite his warning, or perhaps because of it, I insisted. We huddled around my laptop as Ryan connected his equipment. The footage from his 360-degree camera began to play. The quality was better than what had come through during the live feed. I could see clearly now what had been in that second house. The circle of furniture. The collection of personal items in the center like some sort of shrine. And when the shapes appeared, I could see them in horrifying detail. They were human-shaped, but wrong, limbs too long, movements too fluid for underwater, skin pale and wrinkled from long submersion. Their faces were the worst part, distorted, with eyes that had grown oversized and entirely black, mouths that opened far wider than human mouths should, revealing rows of small, sharp teeth. But most disturbing of all was that some of them wore recognizable clothing: a postal worker's uniform, a floral dress, a child's Superman pajamas, all degraded by decades underwater but identifiable. Were those the original residents? I whispered, feeling ill. I don't think so, Ryan said quietly. At least, not entirely. The houses were only occupied for a few months before the flooding. But look, he pointed to a figure in the background wearing modern diving gear. Gear that was maybe only a year old. Connor made a choked sound. That's Jamie's equipment. His custom wetsuit with the red stripe. The implications were too horrible to contemplate. Whatever was down there had been taking people, not just the original residents, who might have been trapped in the flooding, though that seemed unlikely given the official history. But divers who had come to explore over the years. They were collecting things, May said, pointing to the arrangement in the center of the room. Personal items, like trophies, and they nearly added us to their collection, Ryan added grimly. We watched as the footage showed their retreat from the house, pursued by the pale figures. Only when they had ascended about 20 feet did the pursuit stop. The figures gathering at the edge of the submerged neighborhood, watching as the divers fled. After viewing the footage, we packed up in silence and returned to shore as quickly as possible. None of us spoke much during the drive back to town. That night, we met in my hotel room to discuss what to do with the material we'd gathered. We can't release this, Ryan said firmly. Not the full footage. People need to be warned, Connor argued. That thing I saw wearing Jamie's gear. Other divers need to know what's down there. If we release this as is, one of two things will happen, May pointed out. Either everyone will think it's fake, some Blair Witch-style marketing stunt, or it will attract more divers who want to see for themselves. She was right. I'd built my channel on authenticity, never staging or fabricating experiences. This footage was real, but it would strain credibility. And the last thing we wanted was to attract thrill seekers to Lakewood Estates. In the end, we compromised. I produced a video documenting the history of the flooded subdivision and showing carefully edited footage of the houses and their contents. The preserved rooms, the furniture, the eerie stillness of a neighborhood frozen in time. But we excluded any mention or footage of what we'd encountered in that second house. Instead, I emphasized the dangers of diving in restricted areas, the very real risks of exploring underwater structures, and the importance of respecting memorial site, because that's what Lakewood Estates had become in my mind, a memorial, not just to the community that was lost to the waters, but to whatever had emerged in its place, something that remembered enough of being human to collect photographs and toys, to arrange furniture in familiar patterns, but had transformed into something else entirely. The video performed well, but not spectacularly. Some viewers commented that it seemed like I was holding something back, that the usual enthusiasm I showed for my explorations was muted. They were right, of course, but I couldn't bring myself to manufacture excitement about a place that still haunts my nightmares. In the months following our expedition, strange things began happening. Items in my apartment would move overnight. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments as if someone had been examining them. The water pressure in my shower would fluctuate unexpectedly, sometimes becoming so intense that it left my skin red and raw. Worst of all were the dreams. Dreams of dark water and pale figures circling my bed, reaching out with elongated fingers that left trails of moisture on my sheets. Ryan, May, and Connor reported similar experience. Connor was the first to take drastic action, moving from Tennessee to Arizona. As far large bodies of water as I can get, he told me during our last conversation. May threw herself into a research project, collecting accounts of similar phenomena in other reservoirs created during the mid-20th century. She's found enough patterns to suggest that Lakewood Estates isn't unique, that something about the violent disruption of flooding human habitations sometimes creates conditions for transformation. Ryan stopped diving altogether. Last I heard, he'd sold his business and taken a job teaching high school physics in Milwaukee. He never explained his career change to his peers, but I know why he did it. Some things once seen make it impossible to return to the depth. As for me, I've continued my channel, though I now focus exclusively on above-ground locations. No matter how enticing an underwater exploration might sound, I refuse all such suggestions. The footage from Lakewood Estates stays locked in a secure cloud account, accessible only to the 4 of us who were there that day. A digital reminder that some things are meant to stay submerged and forgotten. But sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I swear I can hear the sound of water dripping from nowhere. And in those moments, I know with absolute certainty that what we found in those underwater houses hasn't forgotten us. That somewhere in a darkened living room 60 feet below the surface of Wood Lake, our photographs have been added to the collection at the center of the room. New trophies for whatever waits there, patient and watching for the next visitors to descend into their domain. If you ever find yourself boating on Wood Lake and see areas marked as restricted for diving, believe the signs. What waits in the homes below isn't just the past preserved. It's something that remembers being human once and resents those of us who still are. It started with a number station. You know, one of those mysterious shortwave radio broadcasts that consist of synthesized voices reading strings of numbers or letters. They've been around since the Cold War, most likely used by intelligence agencies to communicate with field operatives. At least that's the prevailing theory. My name's Marcus Chen. I run a YouTube channel called Signal Hunters, where I track down weird broadcasts, forgotten technologies, and electronic anomalies. It's a niche interest, but I've built a dedicated following of about 80,000 subscribers who share my fascination with the stranger corners of our electromagnetic landscape. The whole thing began 3 months ago when a viewer named Radio Headcase 94 sent me a recording they'd picked up while scanning shortwave frequencies in the Midwest. The audio file contained what sounded like a standard numbers station broadcast. A female voice mechanically reciting groups of 5 digits, followed by a brief musical interlude. A few bars from what I recognized as Satay's Jiminapedi number 1, before repeating the sequence. But there was something different about this one. Most number stations broadcast at regular intervals from powerful transmitters, allowing them to be picked up across continents. This signal was weak, localized, and according to my viewer, only broadcast during very specific windows between 2:17 a.m. and 2:42 a.m. on nights with a waning moon. That lunar connection was what caught my attention. Intelligence agencies don't plan their communications around lunar cycles. This was something else. I emailed Radio Headcase 94 for more information. They shared the approximate location where they'd recorded the broadcast, a rural area near the border between Michigan's Upper Peninsula and Wisconsin, and confirmed they'd been able to pick it up on 3 separate occasions, always during that same always during the waning moon phase. The strangest part, they wrote, is that the numbers change each time, but the music stays the same. And sometimes if you listen closely during the musical interlude, you can hear what sounds like whispering underneath. They attached a cleaned up version of the recording where they'd isolated and amplified the audio beneath the piano notes. The whispering was barely audible, but it was definitely there. A voice speaking what sounded like backwards English. I was hooked. This was exactly the kind of mystery that my channel thrived on. After some back and forth, Radio Headcase 94, whose real name was Allison, agreed to meet me and help locate the source of the transmission. 2 weeks later, I drove from Chicago to the Upper Peninsula, my car loaded with radio direction finding equipment, cameras and camping gear. Allison had suggested we meet at a diner in a small town called Pine Ridge, about 20 miles from where she'd recorded the signal. Allison wasn't what I expected. Based on her username and technical knowledge, I'd pictured someone like me, a gearhead in their 30s with too many antennas on their car. Instead, she was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore hiking boots, cargo pants, and a weathered flannel shirt that suggested serious outdoor experience. "You must be Marcus," she said as I slid into the booth across from her. "Hope you brought good boots. Where we're going, there aren't many trails." Over plates of eggs and hash browns, she explained more about her discovery. Allison worked as a forest manager for a timber company that owned large tracts of land in the area. Part of her job involved living in remote cabins for weeks at a time, monitoring forest health and marking trees for potential harvesting. "I'm a bit of an insomniac," she explained. "Shortwave listening helps pass the time when I can't sleep. 3 months ago, I picked up this broadcast while staying at a cabin about 15 miles from here. At first, I thought it was just one of the usual number stations. I've logged dozens of them over the years. But the lunar timing made it unusual." "And you're sure about the moon connection?" I asked. She nodded. "Absolutely. I've tested it extensively. The broadcast only happens during the waning moon phase, never during waxing or full moon. It's always exactly 25 minutes long, always starts at 2:17 a.m. local time." "Any theories about what it might be?" Allison shrugged. "Could be someone's art project, maybe some ham radio operator with eccentric habits, but..." She hesitated. "But what?" "The location is odd. I've triangulated it to an area with no road access, no power lines, nothing but deep forest for miles. And it's not public land. It belongs to the timber company I work for, but it's designated as a non-harvest zone." "Why non-harvest?" "Historical significance, supposedly. There was an old research station out there in the night. Company records are vague about what kind of research. Just that it was some government project that shut down in..." Now, I was really intrigued. Cold War era research, mysterious broadcasts on a lunar schedule, hidden facilities in remote forests. This was content gold for my channel. We spent the rest of the day preparing. Allison had secured permission for us to access the timber company land, under the pretense of conducting a specialized forest health survey. We would hike in the following morning, set up camp within signal range, and wait for the next broadcast window, which would occur that night. The hike was more demanding than I'd anticipated. Though physically fit, I wasn't used to navigating the dense undergrowth and uneven terrain of old-growth forest. Allison moved with the confidence of someone who spent more time among trees than people, occasionally stopping to point out interesting flora or warning me about particularly treacherous footing. After about 4 hours of hiking, we reached a small clearing that Allison deemed suitable for our base camp. By her calculations, we were within 2 miles of the probable transmission source. We'll set up here, rest, and then do a preliminary recon with the direction-finding gear before sunset, she said, shrugging off her heavy pack. That should give us a better fix on the location, so we're ready to move in closer when the broadcasts start. We established our camp efficiently. 2 small tents, a shared cooking area, and a tarp-covered space for our electronic equipment. I was impressed with Allison's methodical approach. She clearly wasn't just a casual radio enthusiast, but someone with serious field experience. By late afternoon, we had our direction-finding gear assembled. A portable SDR software-defined radio receiver connected to a laptop, and a high-gain directional antenna that we could rotate to pinpoint signal sources. Since the mystery station wasn't currently broadcasting, we tested our setup on known signals, including a distant AM radio station and Allison's emergency beacon. As dusk approached, we ate a simple meal of freeze-dried stew and discussed our plan for the night. The broadcast wouldn't begin until 2:17 a.m., but we wanted to be in position well before that. I suggest we try to sleep for a few hours and set alarms for 1 a.m., Allison said. That gives us enough time to hike closer to the source before the transmission starts. I agreed, though I doubted I'd be able to sleep with the anticipation of what we might discover. As darkness fell completely, the forest around us transformed. The daytime chorus of birds gave way to the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small mammals in the underbrush, and the constant symphony of insects. Despite my excitement, fatigue from the long hike eventually pulled me into a fitful sleep. I dreamed of radio dials turning by themselves and voices speaking in code through layers of static. Allison's gentle shake woke me from these dreams. "It's time," she whispered, her headlamp casting strange shadows across her face. The forest at night was an entirely different world. Our headlamps carved narrow cones of visibility through the absolute darkness, while the rest of our surroundings remained hidden in impenetrable black. The temperature had dropped significantly, and our breath formed small clouds in the beam of light. We moved slowly, carrying only essential equipment: the SDR receiver, laptop directional antenna, and basic survival gear. Allison led the way, occasionally consulting her GPS to ensure we were moving in the right direction. After about 40 minutes of careful hiking, she stopped and held up a hand. "Let's set up here and check the signal. We should be close enough to get a good reading when the broadcast starts." We were in a small clearing where a fallen tree had created a natural opening in the canopy. Above us, the waning moon cast a silver light that barely penetrated the dense forest, but provided just enough illumination to set up our equipment. The digital clock on my laptop read we had 13 minutes until the expected start of the transmission. I connected our antenna, booted up the SDR software, and began scanning the shortwave bands where Allison had previously detected the signal. The radio spectrum displayed on my screen showed the usual distant chatter, commercial broadcasts from hundreds of miles away, the occasional burst of static from atmospheric disturbances, and the steady signals of navigation beacons, but nothing unusual yet. 2 minutes, Allison said quietly, eyes fixed on the screen. At exactly 2:17 a.m., a new signal appeared on our display. A strong, clear broadcast cutting through the background noise. I quickly tuned to its frequency, and through our headphones came the familiar sound from Allison's recording. A synthesized female voice methodically reading groups of 5 numbers. 7, 3, 9, 4, 2, 9, 1, 6, 8, 0, 4, 7, 2. The voice was artificial but not quite like modern text-to-speech systems. It had an older quality to it, reminiscent of early computer speech synthesizers from the 1980s. I rotated our directional antenna slowly, watching the signal strength meter on the screen. When the meter peaked, I locked the antenna in position. "That way," I whispered, pointing into the darkness between two ancient pines. "Maybe half a mile." Allison nodded and marked the bearing on her GPS. We continued listening as the transmission progressed through its sequence of number groups. After exactly 3 minutes, the numbers stopped, and the haunting piano notes of Gymnopédie number 1 began to play. "There," Allison whispered, adjusting the audio processing on our receiver. The whispering, with the gain turned up and a filter applied to isolate certain frequencies, we could just make out a voice underneath the piano music. It was speaking English, but in reverse. I quickly opened an audio recording app on my phone and held it near the laptop speaker to capture the sound for later analysis. The musical interlude lasted exactly 1 minute before the numbers resumed. This pattern repeated 4 more times. 3 minutes of numbers, 1 minute of music with hidden whispers. At 2:42 a.m., precisely 25 minutes after it had begun, the broadcast abruptly ended. The signal disappeared from our spectrum display as if someone had flipped a switch. "Should we try to find the source now?" I asked, already packing up our equipment. Allison shook her head. "Too dangerous in the dark. We know where it is now. Better to get some rest and approach in daylight." Reluctantly, I agreed. We marked the location on Allison's GPS and made our way back to camp. Though exhausted, I couldn't help listening to the recording I'd made of the whispered voice. Playing it in reverse on my phone, we could now make out fragments of what was being said. Subject 7 remains responsive. Unexplained temporal anomalies continue. Moonlight catalyzes the effect. Dr. Weiss recommends termination of. The rest was too garbled to understand. Whatever this was, it didn't sound like a simple art project or eccentric hobbyist. The clinical tone and terminology suggested something more institutional. Dawn broke with a heavy mist clinging to the forest floor. After a quick breakfast, we packed light day bags and set off in the direction of our bearing from the previous night. Allison moved with even greater caution than before, frequently stopping to listen and observe our surroundings. "Something's off about these woods," she murmured at one point. "I've worked in forests all over this region, but this area feels different." I knew what she meant. There was an unnatural stillness to the place. Fewer birds, less rustling in the undergrowth. The trees themselves seemed oddly uniform in age and spacing, despite this supposedly being old-growth forest. After about 40 minutes of hiking, we came upon a small stream. Allison consulted her GPS. "We're close," she said. "Should be just beyond that rise." We crossed the stream and climbed a gentle slope. At the top, we stopped abruptly. Below us, in a perfectly circular clearing about 100 feet in diameter, stood a concrete structure. It was obviously man-made but had been reclaimed by nature over decades. Vines wrapped around its walls, and small trees grew from cracks in its foundation. The building was octagonal, single-story, with no windows and only one visible entrance. A heavy metal door, now hanging partially open on rusted hinges. "The research station," Allison whispered. "Has to be." We approached cautiously. The clearing around the building was too perfect to be natural. A perfect circle with the structure at its center. Even more strangely, the boundary between forest and clearing was unnaturally sharp, as if the trees refused to encroach beyond some invisible barrier. The entrance door creaked ominously as I pushed it wider. Inside was darkness. Our headlamps revealed a dusty antechamber with faded government warning signs still visible on the walls. "Restricted area," and "Athodicide personnel only." Beyond this first room was a corridor that split in 2 directions. following the octagonal shape of the building. We decided to go left, moving slowly, our footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The first room we encountered appeared to be some kind of monitoring station. Ancient computer terminals with green phosphor displays sat dormant on metal desks. Paper printouts had turned yellow with age, their contents mostly illegible. On one wall hung a large map of the night sky, with certain star configurations circled in red. "This is Cold War-era equipment," I said, examining one of the terminals. Late 50s, Allison was looking at a heavy metal filing cabinet in the corner. To our surprise, it wasn't locked. Inside were folders containing what appeared to be observation logs. Most were too degraded to read, but one page caught her attention. "Look at this," she said, holding the bristle paper carefully. "Project Ichemoon, examination of temporospatial anomalies triggered by lunar cyclical variations." Whatever they were studying here, it had something to do with the moon phase. We continued exploring the facility, finding what appeared to be living quarters, a small medical area, and a cafeteria, all abandoned in what seemed to be a hurried evacuation. Coffee cups still sat on tables, personal items left behind in the sleeping quarter. At the center of the octagonal building was a large circular room. Unlike the rest of the facility, this space had been maintained. The dust was less pronounced, and in the center of the room stood a device that looked operational. It was a complex apparatus consisting of antenna arrays, vacuum tubes, early transistor circuits, and at its heart, a glass chamber containing what appeared to be a small meteorite. A black, porous rock, about the size of a baseball. Connected to this central device was a more modern addition, a digital timer and transmission system that looked to have been installed much more recently, perhaps within the last few years. "This is it," I whispered. "The broadcast source." Allison pointed to the timer. "Look at the settings." The digital display showed a programmed activation time of 2:17 a.m., with a duration of 25 minutes. Additional settings specified activate only during lunar phase, waning. "Someone updated the original equipment to broadcast automatically," I said. "But why? And what's with the rock?" Before Allison could answer, a metallic scraping sound came from the entrance of the facility. We quickly turned off our headlamps and pressed ourselves against the wall of the central chamber. Footsteps echoed through the corridors, coming close. A beam of light swept across the room briefly before focusing on the central apparatus. In its glow, we could make out a figure dressed in what appeared to be an old-fashioned lab coat. The stranger moved to the device and began adjusting something. As they worked, I slowly raised my phone and silently took several photos with the night mode camera. The figure spoke aloud to no one in particular, their voice eerily similar to the backward whispers we'd heard beneath the piano music. Subject 7 continues to respond to transmission. Temporal displacement holding steady at -58 years. Dr. Weiss's concerns about dimensional bleed-through appear unfounded. Project Ichemoon protocols will continue. The stranger finished their adjustments and left as quietly as they had come. We waited 10 tense minutes before daring to move or speak. "What the hell was that about?" I whispered finally. Allison's face was pale in the dim light of our now reactivated headlamps. "Temporal displacement? -58 years? Marcus, I think they're communicating through time." It sounded absurd, but after what we'd seen and heard, I couldn't dismiss it. The numbers could be coordinates or instructions, and the music with the whispers, a way to send voice data. But communicating with who, and from when to when? I looked at the meteorite in its glass chamber. Maybe that rock has properties we don't understand. Something affected by moonlight. We spent another hour documenting everything we could, taking photos, collecting readable documents, recording video of the equipment. As we prepared to leave, Allison noticed something we'd overlooked. A small digital camera mounted in the corner of the central chamber. "We've been seen," she said grimly. We hurried back to our camp, packed our gear, and began the long hike out of the forest. Neither of us spoke much, both lost in contemplation of what we'd discovered. The implications were staggering. A Cold War-era experiment in using some extraterrestrial material to communicate across time. Still operational decades later, with someone still monitoring and maintaining the equipment. 3 days later, back in Chicago, I began the painstaking process of analyzing our findings. The photos, the audio recordings, the few documents we'd been able to salvage, all painted a fragmentary picture of Project EcoMoon. From what we could piece together, scientists in 1962 had discovered that the meteorite, which had fallen in that very forest in 1958, exhibited quantum properties that allowed information to be transmitted backward through time when exposed to certain wavelengths of moonlight. They had established a communication channel with themselves in 1904, creating a temporal loop of information. But something had gone wrong. The documents referred to unexpected consequences and temporal contamination. The project had been officially shut down, but clearly, someone had continued the work in secret. I was editing the footage for what would surely be the most explosive episode of Signal Hunters ever, when my phone rang. It was Allison. "Turn on the news," she said without preamble. "Any channel." I did as she asked. Every station was covering the same breaking story. An unprecedented geomagnetic storm had knocked out power across much of North America. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the date displayed on the news ticker, April. "Marcus," Allison's voice was shaking. "Something's happening." I think the call dropped. Outside my window, Chicago's skyline began to shimmer and warp, buildings transforming before my eyes, some disappearing, others changing shape. My computer screen flashed, and a new document appeared, a text file containing a long string of 5-digit numbers. And behind it, almost subliminally, I could hear the first notes of Gymnopédie number 1 playing from my speaker. I grabbed my phone to call Allison back, but the screen now displayed only one message: Project EcoMoon terminated. Temporal reset initiated. And then, darkness. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. My calendar showed it was 3 months earlier, the day before Radiohead Case 94 had first contacted me about the mysterious numbers station. My computer contained no records of our correspondence. My phone had no photos from the forest expedition. It was as if none of it had happened. But when I checked my email, there was a new message from an address I didn't recognize. It contained only an audio file and a brief note. "Don't look for the signal this time. Some broadcasts are better left unheard." I played the audio file. It was Eric Satie's Gymnopédie, just the piano. No voices, no numbers. But in the quieter passages, if I listened very carefully, I could just make out a whisper beneath the notes. "Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed." I deleted the email, closed my laptop, and never ran another episode of Signal Hunters again. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. The call from the Historical Society came on a Tuesday morning. I'd almost forgotten I'd applied for the grant 6 months earlier. A modest sum to document the abandoned lighthouses of Lake Superior's southern shore. As a maritime historian specializing in Great Lakes navigation, I'd spent years researching these forgotten sentinels, but had never had the funding to visit the more remote locations. Dr. Elaine Mercer, this is Howard Phillips from the Northland Historical Preservation Society. I'm pleased to inform you that your grant proposal has been approved. 2 weeks later, I found myself driving along the rugged coastline of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, my SUV loaded with camera equipment, historical records, and camping gear. My first destination was the Whitefish Point Light, well maintained and documented. From there, I would work my way westward, visiting progressively more isolated structure. The Society had been particularly interested in my proposal to document the Copper Harbor Auxiliary Light, a structure so obscure it appeared in few official records after. Located on a remote peninsula accessible only by boat or a difficult hiking trail, It had been decommissioned in the 1920s when a more powerful lighthouse was built nearby. According to my research, the auxiliary light had been abandoned rather than demolished, likely due to its remote location making removal too costly. What made the Copper Harbor Auxiliary particularly intriguing was a series of anomalous entries I'd found in the lighthouse keeper's logs from 1921. The final entry, dated October 17, 1926, simply read, "It comes from the light itself. God help us all." After that, the lighthouse was officially decommissioned, and the keeper, one Thomas Landry, was relocated to a station on Lake Michigan. I'd tried to track down his descendants without success. After a week of documenting the better-known lighthouses, I finally reached the small town of Copper Harbor. The local maritime museum had little information about the auxiliary light. Just a single faded photograph showing a square stone tower about 50 feet tall, attached to a small keeper's house. "That old place," said the elderly docent when I inquired. "Nobody's been out there in decades, not officially. Anyway, some kids tried to camp out there in the 80s, came back before nightfall, talking nonsense about moving shadows and lights where no lights should be." She shook her head dismissively. "Probably just got spooked in an old building. But the peninsula it's on is treacherous, sharp rocks underwater, unpredictable currents. We lost 2 good boats trying to reach it over the years. Most folks go by the hiking trail now, but it's a hard 4-hour trek one way." I opted for the trail. Early the next morning, equipped with my hiking gear and enough supplies for an overnight stay, I set out. The path began clearly enough, but gradually became overgrown and difficult to follow. The forest grew denser, the terrain more challenging. By noon, I should have covered more than half the distance, but according to my GPS, I'd made far less progress than expected. Strange, too, was the silence that had descended. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves, had diminished to almost nothing. The air felt strangely pressurized, as if a storm approached, yet the sky remained clear. It was nearly 4 p.m. when I finally emerged from the forest onto a rocky bluff overlooking the lake. Below me stood the lighthouse, remarkably intact, despite a century of abandonment. The square tower rose from a small stone keeper's house, its lantern room still glazed, though clouded with decades of grime. No light had shone from that room in nearly 100 years, yet something about it made me uneasy, as if it were merely dormant rather than dead. The descent to the lighthouse was treacherous, but I managed it carefully. Up close, the structure was even more impressive, built from local stone that had weathered to a silvery gray. Vines had claimed much of the exterior, but the building itself seemed structurally sound. The door was locked, but a window at the rear had been broken long ago. I carefully cleared the remaining glass and climbed through, finding myself in what had once been the keeper's kitchen. Dust covered everything, undisturbed for decades, except for occasional animal intrusion. The furniture remained, a small table, chairs, cabinets, all time-worn but still recognizable. I spent the next few hours photographing and documenting the main floor, the kitchen, a small parlor, and what appeared to be an office with rotting logbooks too deteriorated to read. As daylight began to fade, I set up my camp stove in the parlor and prepared a simple dinner, planning to explore the tower itself the following morning. As darkness fell, I noticed something odd. Though I had brought no light powerful enough to reach the lantern room atop the tower, occasionally I thought I saw a faint glow from above, visible through the interior stairwell. When I investigated climbing the iron spiral stairs with my flashlight, I found only darkness and decades of dust. The lantern mechanism itself was long gone, with only mounting brackets remaining. I attributed the apparent glow to tricks of the setting sun on the aged glass panels, and returned to the parlor to arrange my sleeping bag. Outside, the lake had grown restless, waves crashing against the peninsula's rocky shore. A wind had risen, moaning around the old stone structure with a sound almost like distant voices. Sleep came with difficulty. I drifted in and out of unsettling dreams. Visions of the tower consumed in cold blue flames, of something vast moving beneath the lake's surface, of a keeper frantically writing in his log while shadows that moved independently of their sources gathered around him. I was awakened after midnight by a sound I couldn't immediately identify, a rhythmic clicking, like the mechanical rotation of the absent lantern mechanism. With it came a subtle vibration through the stone floors, as if machinery long dormant had somehow reactivated. Most disturbing of all was the light, a sickly blue-green glow, now visibly emanating from the lantern room, pulsing in a pattern that felt decidedly intentional. Gathering my courage and my flashlight, I ascended the spiral stairs once more. The glow intensified as I climbed, casting strange shadows that seemed to move slightly out of sync with my movements. The air grew colder, with an ozone smell like the aftermath of a lightning strike. At the top landing, I hesitated before the door to the lantern room. The blue-green light seeped through the cracks around its frame, pulsing in that same rhythmic pattern. The clicking had grown louder, unmistakably mechanical, yet with an organic undertone, like the chittering of massive insects. I pushed the door open. The lantern room was empty of any conventional light mechanism. Instead, hovering in the center of the space was a twisting column of what I can only describe as liquid light. A spiraling vortex of blue-green luminescence about 7 feet tall and 2 feet in diameter. It rotated slowly, the source of both the clicking sound and the pulsing light. As I stood transfixed, the vortex seemed to notice my presence. The rotation slowed, and the light shifted, tendrils of luminescence reaching toward me like curious fingers. In its depths, I thought I glimpsed images, impossible scenes of cyclopean structures beneath vast oceans, of creatures composed of light and geometry rather than flesh, of stars arranged in patterns that hurt my mind to perceive. Most terrifying was the sense of intelligence. This was not a natural phenomenon, but something conscious, something that had been waiting. I recalled the keeper's final log entry. It comes from the light itself. I backed away, but those tendrils of light continued to reach for me, elongating impossibly where they touched the stone walls. The material seemed to soften and flow like wet. One brushed my hand, and I felt a sensation like ice and electricity combined, accompanied by whispers directly in my mind. Words in no human language. Concepts that human consciousness was never meant to contain. I fled, stumbling down the spiral stairs in darkness, my flashlight forgotten in the lantern room. Behind me, the light intensified, and the entire tower began to vibrate. I grabbed my backpack from the parlor, leaving the rest of my equipment, and escaped through the window I'd entered by. Outside, the night had transformed. The sky above the lighthouse swirled with aurora-like lights that should have been impossible at this latitude. The waters of Lake Superior had withdrawn from the shore by nearly 50 feet, exposing lakebed that writhed with luminous patterns, matching those in the tower. I didn't wait to see more. I scrambled up the bluff and plunged into the forest, guided only by moonlight and terror. I ran until my lungs burned, then walked, then ran again whenever that blue-green glow seemed to strengthen behind me. Dawn found me miles from the lighthouse, exhausted and disoriented, but alive. I eventually found the main trail and made my way back to Copper Harbor, arriving as evening fell. That night, a storm of unprecedented intensity struck the peninsula. Satellite images later showed lightning concentrated around the auxiliary light's location for nearly 6 continuous hours. A meteorological impossibility. When the storm cleared, Coast Guard flyovers reported no significant damage to the area, except for one detail. The lighthouse was gone, not destroyed but simply absent, as if it had never existed. In its place was a perfect circular depression in the bedrock, 30 feet in diameter, and nearly 10 feet deep. The Historical Society was disappointed by my lack of photographic evidence. attributing my wild story to a concussion from a fall on the trail. I did have an unexplained head injury when I returned. My academic reputation suffered, and I eventually left the field of maritime history altogether. But sometimes, on nights when the aurora borealis is visible over the Great Lakes, I see familiar patterns in its shifting curtains of light. The same patterns I glimpsed in that vortex. And occasionally, ships still report seeing a blue-green light where no lighthouse should be, pulsing in a sequence that marine experts have recently recognized is mathematically identical to a binary code. A code that, when translated, repeats one message: the door remains open. I've never returned to Lake Superior. Some lights are meant to guide ships to safety, but others may guide something else entirely to our shores, and some forgotten places should remain forgotten. I was 17 when I found the tunnel behind my house. That summer was supposed to be boring. My parents had moved us from Boston to rural New Hampshire for my father's new job, leaving me stranded in a town where I knew no one, and nothing ever happened. Our house was an old Victorian on 3 acres of wooded land, the kind of place that would have been charming if I hadn't been an angry teenager mourning my abandoned social life. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the town center was an 8-minute drive down a winding country road. My bedroom was in what had once been an attic, remodeled into living space by previous owners. The ceiling sloped sharply on one side, and there were strange angles and nooks everywhere. I hated it at first. The uneven floors, the way the wind seemed to find every gap in the old windows, the persistent smell of mothballs that no amount of cleaning would eliminate. It was during one of my cleaning attempts trying to banish that smell that I found it. I was pulling up the ancient carpet in one corner, planning to replace it with something that didn't reek of a previous century, when I noticed the floorboards beneath didn't match the rest of the room. They were newer, lighter in color, and not quite flush with the surrounding floor. Curious, I pried at them with a screwdriver. To my surprise, they lifted easily, revealing a small trapdoor about 2 feet square. Beneath was darkness and the top of a wooden ladder descending into the wall. I knew immediately I should tell my parents. Our house was over 100 years old, and finding a hidden passageway should have been cause for adult intervention. But something stopped me. Perhaps simple teenage rebellion. Perhaps something deeper. This was mine, the first interesting thing I'd found in this godforsaken town. The opening was just large enough for me to squeeze through. I grabbed my phone for its flashlight and descended the ladder into the darkness. The ladder led down about 15 feet. Ending in a narrow tunnel that ran perpendicular to the back wall of the house. It was roughly hewn from the earth and lined with old wood beams, just tall enough for me to stand upright. The air was surprisingly dry and cool, with that peculiar stillness you find in places long undisturbed. My phone's light revealed 2 directions I could take. To the left, the tunnel extended maybe 20 feet before ending at what appeared to be a cave-in. To the right, it continued into darkness beyond the reach of my light. I turned right and began walking slowly, counting my steps to make sure I could find my way back. The tunnel maintained a constant width and height, curving gently in what I estimated was the direction of the woods behind our property. After about 100 steps, I noticed something odd. The sound of my footfalls had changed. Instead of the dull thud of earth, they produced a subtle echo, as if the space ahead had opened up. 20 steps later, my light revealed why. The tunnel emptied into a circular chamber about 30 feet in diameter. The walls were no longer rough-hewn but smoothly curved, as if carved from solid rock. Strangest of all was the floor. perfectly flat and made of some dark material that reflected my light like obsidian glass. In the center of this chamber stood a stone pedestal about waist high, and on it rested a bronze disc approximately a foot in diameter. The disc appeared ancient, its surface etched with concentric circles and symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't like any language I'd seen before. Not Latin or Greek or anything taught in school, but something more primal, patterns that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. I approached cautiously, my light catching glints of tarnished metal. The chamber was utterly silent. Even the ambient sounds of earth and distant wildlife that had accompanied me in the tunnel were absent here. It felt as if the space existed in some pocket separate from the world above. When I reached the pedestal, I hesitated before touching the disc. Some instinct warned me that this was a boundary, that whatever I did next would be irrevocable. But curiosity has always been my downfall. I reached out and placed my palm flat against the cold bronze. Nothing happened at first. Then I felt it, a subtle vibration rising through the metal into my hand, accompanied by a sound so low it was more felt than heard. The disc began to rotate slowly beneath my palm, though I wasn't applying any pressure. The symbols along its edge seemed to glow faintly with an inner light. I should have backed away then, but I was transfixed by the disc's movement, by the symbols now definitely glowing with a pale blue luminescence that illuminated the chamber far better than my phone's flashlight. The humming grew louder, resonating within my chest cavity. "Hello," I whispered, and that was my second mistake. The chamber caught my voice and returned it, not as a simple echo, but transformed. My simple greeting came back as a cascade of whispers in multiple tones, some distinctly not my own. I jerked my hand away from the disc, but it continued rotating, its speed gradually increasing. From the walls of the chamber I heard a sound like rushing wind, though the air remained perfectly still. This wind resolved into voices, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them speaking over each other in languages I couldn't understand. They ebbed and flowed like tides, occasionally forming phrases in English that sent chills down my spine. "Found us again. The doorway opens both ways. They never learn." I backed away from the pedestal toward the tunnel entrance, but the voices grew louder, and the blue glow from the disc intensified. The pedestal itself began to sink slowly into the obsidian floor, which rippled like liquid despite appearing solid beneath my feet. As the disc descended, the center of the floor began to open, not cracking or breaking, but dilating like a pupil, revealing a spiraling darkness below. A cold wind emerged from this opening, carrying with it a scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and wrong. I turned and ran, sprinting back through the tunnel toward the ladder. Behind me, the voices rose to a crescendo, no longer whispering but calling, some pleading, others commanding. The blue light pulsed, throwing my desperate shadow ahead of me against the tunnel walls. I reached the ladder and scrambled up, bursting through the trapdoor into my bedroom. I slammed it shut and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. After several minutes, when nothing pursued me, I cautiously placed my ear against the trapdoor. Silence. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every creak of our old house, expecting something to emerge from the walls or floor. That night, I barricaded the trapdoor with my dresser and lay awake until dawn, watching the corner of my room. In the light of morning, it all seemed like a bizarre dream. Had I really found a secret tunnel leading to an impossible chamber with a mysterious bronze disc? I might have convinced myself it was imagination if not for the dirt on my clothes and the cuts on my hands from my panicked climb up the ladder. I avoided my room for the next few days, sleeping on the couch and making excuses to my parents about wanting to watch late-night TV. But curiosity and a stubborn denial of fear eventually drew me back. I had to know if it was real, and if so, what was down there. 5 days after my first discovery, I moved the dresser and opened the trapdoor again. The tunnel was still there, dark and uninviting. This time I came prepared with a proper flashlight, extra batteries, and my father's hammer, a pathetic weapon against whatever had spoken to me. But it provided some psychological comfort. I descended the ladder more cautiously this time, and made my way back through the tunnel. Part of me hoped to find the passage ended in earth or that the chamber had been a hallucination. But the tunnel continued just as before, curving gently away from the house. At the point where the tunnel had previously opened into the chamber, I now found only solid earth, a dead end as if the chamber had never existed. I pushed against the dirt wall, thinking it might be some kind of concealment, but it was solid and unyielding. Confused and oddly disappointed, I returned to my room. Had I imagined the entire chamber experience? Was I losing my mind in the isolation of this new town? That night, I heard the voices for the first time in my bedroom. They started as whispers at the edge of perception, coming from the vicinity of the trapdoor, which I had firmly closed and barricaded again. By midnight, they were clear enough that I could make out words, the same phrases I'd heard in the chamber. Found us again. The doorway opens both ways. They never learn. I told myself it was just the wind in the eaves of the old house, or pipes settling, or my imagination working overtime. But when I finally fell into an exhausted sleep near dawn, my dreams were filled with the circular chamber, the disc now hovering in midair, spinning faster and faster as the floor opened beneath it to reveal. I woke gasping, the memory of what I'd seen already fading like mist. But one thing remained clear, a sense that something was now aware of me, aware of my house, aware of the passage between our worlds. The voices continued each night, growing incrementally louder, occasionally joined by knocking sounds from beneath the floor. I began to notice other strange occurrences. Objects in my room moved when I wasn't looking. The temperature would suddenly drop without explanation. My phone would lose power unexpectedly, only to recharge itself minutes later. A week after my second exploration attempt, I was awakened at 3:17 a.m. by complete silence. The usual creaks and settling sounds of the old house were absent, as were the whispers that had become my nightly companions. Even the ambient sounds of the rural night, distant traffic, insects, the wind in trees had vanished. In that perfect silence, I heard the trapdoor unlock itself. The dresser I had pushed over it slid slowly across the floor with a sound like quiet laughter. I lay paralyzed in my bed as the trapdoor lifted open. No light came from below, only a profound darkness that seemed to absorb what little moonlight filtered through my window. From this darkness emerged a hand. No, not quite a hand, but something hand-like, with too many joints and skin that gleamed like the obsidian floor of the chamber. That was when I finally screamed, breaking whatever spell had held me immobile. I leapt from my bed and ran, not stopping until I reached my parents' room. Their confusion at being awakened by their hysterical teenager quickly turned to concern as I babbled about tunnels and voices and things coming through the floor. My father, practical to a fault, insisted on investigating immediately. Armed with a flashlight and his hunting rifle, the appearance of which surprised me. I hadn't known he owned one. He followed me back to my room. The trapdoor was closed. The dresser stood precisely where I had originally positioned it, showing no signs of having been moved. My father checked every corner of the room, then pulled the dresser aside and examined the floor. "There's no trapdoor here, Ellie," he said gently, shining his light on ordinary, unbroken floorboards. "You were having a nightmare." I insisted on showing him the tunnel entrance, growing increasingly frantic as I pulled up carpet to reveal perfectly normal flooring beneath. There was no trace of the lighter wood, no trapdoor, no access to any tunnel. My father eventually led me back to my parents' room, where I spent the remainder of the night on a cot, my mother periodically checking my temperature as if fever might explain my delusion. The next day, my parents took me to a doctor, who referred me to a psychiatrist, who diagnosed me with a combination of adjustment disorder and parasomnia, brought on by the stress of our move. I was prescribed medication that made me foggy but quieted the voice. After a few weeks, convinced I was improving, I stopped taking the pills. The voices didn't return. The trapdoor didn't reappear. Life gradually normalized, and I managed to make a few friends when school started in fall. By winter, the entire episode felt like a strange dream, a story that had happened to someone else. Until the first letter arrived. It came in February, hand-delivered to our mailbox without a stamp or postmark. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with a crude drawing of concentric circles surrounding a spiral, unmistakably similar to the patterns on the bronze disc. Below this symbol was written a single line in an elegant, antique script. The chamber moves but never disappears. I destroyed the letter and told no one, convinced it was my mind playing tricks again. But a second letter arrived a month later, then a third. Each contained variations of the circular pattern and cryptic messages. What is opened can be closed, but not by you alone. The disc responds to blood and breath and thought. We have always been beneath your floors. After the fifth letter, I finally confided in Jamie, the closest friend I'd made since moving to town. I expected disbelief or mockery, but instead she grew pale and asked to see the most recent letter. When I explained I'd destroyed them all, she invited me to her house the following day. Jamie lived in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. In her attic bedroom, she pulled a shoebox from beneath her bed, containing dozens of letters, each bearing the same concentric circle motif I had received. They started coming when I was 14, she explained, after I found a tunnel in our cellar that led to a round room with a metal disc. We compared experiences, finding them nearly identical despite occurring 3 years apart. Jamie had also been told she was experiencing parasomnia. She had also been prescribed medication. Her tunnel and chamber had also disappeared without a trace after her first visit. Over the next few weeks, Jamie introduced me to others, 7 in total, ranging in age from 13 to 72, all living within a 10-mile radius of our town. All had discovered tunnels leading to the same chamber. All had touched the disc. All had heard the voices. The oldest among us, Mr. Calloway, had been researching the phenomenon for decades. In his cluttered study surrounded by maps and geological surveys of the area, he shared what he'd learned. The chamber isn't in any fixed location, he explained. It moves through the substrate beneath our town like a bubble in slowly flowing pitch. It chooses when and where to connect to our world through these tunnels, and it chooses who to reveal itself to. But what is it? I asked. And what does it want? Mr. Calloway's expression darkened. It's old, older than humans. Older maybe than this continent. As for what it wants, he opened a leather-bound journal to a page filled with the same concentric circle patterns. I think it wants to be found, to connect, to communicate. But its concept of communication is different from ours. Different? How? Jamie asked. It doesn't distinguish between physical reality and thought, between past and future. When you speak in the chamber, your voice doesn't just echo. It propagates across possibilities. He looked up at us. Every person who finds the chamber creates a new intersection, a new potential pathway. Pathway for what? I whispered, though I feared I already knew. For them to come through, Mr. Calloway said simply. Whatever they are. That night, back in my room, I woke to the sound of my name being called from somewhere beneath the floor, where the trapdoor had once been. I now saw a faint blue glow outlining a perfect circle. The voices had returned, louder than before, more distinct. Elizabeth, we've been patient. The door opens both ways. Something scratched at the underside of my floor. Not random noises, but deliberate patterns. The same concentric circles from the letters and the disc. I reached for my phone to call Jamie, but as my fingers touched the screen, the device flared with blue light and displayed a single message. We are all connected now. The floor began to ripple like the surface of a pond. From its center rose the bronze disc, hovering in midair, spinning slowly. Behind it, emerging from the rippling floor like a swimmer breaking the surface of water, came something that reflected the light in all the wrong ways. I ran. I haven't been back to that house in 10 years. My parents still live there, wondering why their daughter refuses to visit. Why I insist on meeting them only in public places. They've never found a trapdoor, never heard voices, never seen the floor ripple like water. But Jamie has disappeared. So has Mr. Calloway. 3 others from our group of 9 have gone missing or been found dead under mysterious circumstances. Only 4 of us remain. We stay in contact, warning each other when the letters intensify or when the voices return. We've developed rules for survival. Never sleep in basement rooms or attics. Never stay in one place for more than 6 months. Never lie directly on the ground. Never listen too closely to the spaces between radio stations or phone calls. Most importantly, if you find a tunnel where none should exist, seal it immediately. If you discover a circular chamber with a bronze disc, do not touch it. If you hear voices emerging from beneath your floor, calling your name, promising secrets or threatening consequences, run. Because the chamber is still moving beneath us. The disc is still spinning. The doorway still opens both ways, and they're not finished finding us.